Edo Shidene. Hello, my friends and relatives. So I introduce myself to you in Navajo. My name is Rene Begay. And before I begin my presentation, I would like to say welcome to the Indigenous Voices in Computational Biology webinar series. And I'm very grateful to Larry Hunter and the rest of the people at ISCB for inviting me and the future Indigenous scholars that will be presenting every month here after me. I am the first to present for the introduction to ethical genomic research with Indigenous peoples. I would like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from the lands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho, who are the original stewards of this land in Denver, Colorado, and Colorado in general. I also want to acknowledge all other Indigenous tribes and nations who call Colorado home, which include 48 other tribes, including my own, the Navajo Nation. So this is an overview of the presentation that I will be giving today. So my educational background and who I am, and an overview of Indigenous people just in general, and mostly based in the US because that's where I'm from, but other presenters will most likely give an introduction from where they are. So we're going to have presenters most likely from Canada, New Zealand, Australia. So you get to meet many of them and they can talk from their perspectives. The intersection of genomics and Indigenous people. The SING organization, so the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics. And then genetics research with Indigenous communities, 6 guiding ethical principles, which is one of the papers that was published in 2018 by the SING consortium, including me. And then, of course, a preview of the Native Voices in Computational Biology that you will be seeing in the coming months. So my background and where I'm from. So I'm from the Navajo Nation, which is centered here in the southwest area of the United States, and it goes into Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. And in the middle is also the Hopi Reservation, which is another tribal nation. And the picture below is just a picture of where I'm currently from. And I'm a member of the Navajo Nation, like I mentioned. The Navajo Nation is the size of West Virginia. My mother's clan is Big Water, so Totsohni. My father's clan is Red Bottom, so Ashche. My maternal grandfather's clan is Red Running Into Water. And my paternal grandfather's clan is Towering House Clan, which is Kia'ani. And the Red Running Into Water is Tachini. And the reason why I introduce myself in this way is because a lot of the presenters are Indigenous and they may have a certain way of introducing themselves, and they may introduce themselves in the traditional way. And this is how I was taught growing up, how to present myself and put myself out there, and that I may have relatives in the audience or wherever I'm presenting. And so this is how I identify myself. And so I work as a research assistant, like Larry mentioned, at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus in the School of Public Health. I have a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Arizona. I have my master's in clinical science degree from the Anschutz Medical Campus, and I studied dilated cardiomyopathy, and that's where I found my passion for genetics and ethical and social implications of genetics research. And I was looking at the specific gene called filamin C, and it was found in multiple families in Italy and the US. And currently I am pursuing my master's of public health through Johns Hopkins University. So just a brief overview of Native Americans in general and Indigenous people. In the US, there are about 574 federally recognized distinct tribal nations, and many of them are in Alaska, and they are called villages. And they cross 35 states, and they are sovereign nations, so they have a government-to-government relationship with the US, and they can create their own policies, programs, projects, and so they really act as their own sort of country, or basically of their own state. The history of Native Americans in the US has not been kind to natives. The removal and reservation and treaty period in the early 1800s, which is where the treaties were created in exchange for land from the natives. An allotment and assimilation period where the land was given to settlers, and so they tried to push natives into mainstream American life. So they would go into boarding schools, they had to get an education, they had to work so they could live, and so they were mainly pushed into cities. And then we moved into the Indian reorganization period, where there were no more allotments being taken from natives, and they were trying to restore lands to the tribal nations. And the U.S. government started creating programs and projects to try to rehabilitate the reservations and provide economic stimulus. And then now we're in the nation-to-nation period. There's several more steps in this whole timeline, but I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what has happened and occurred in the U.S. with tribal nations. So right now, in the present, we're in the self-governance of tribal nations, where we are determining our own healthcare, our own economy, policies and governments. And we're really, I think, coming into our own and finding ways to provide for our own people and to work with the U.S. government to kind of reinstate certain things that have been wronged in the past. And I just like to include all Indigenous people and say that we all have our unique cultures, language, traditions, governments, and social norms and research priorities. So even though we're talking about just the U.S., I mean, there's 500 or so that distinct tribal nations that, are very different. And so doing health research, genomics research with any of these tribes, each one will be totally different. And there may be some common themes, but this is the reason and the purpose for this presentation is to let you all know that it's important to engage with the community, to ask their permission to help them or engage with them, and to know when is the right project to engage in. So Indigenous people are underrepresented in genetics research overall. And in 2011, 96% of European descent individuals have been studied using genome-wide association studies. However, if we continue moving forward, we also see that from 2009 to 2016, that European ancestry still dominates. But in 2016, we still see that Native participation has even decreased from 2009 to 2016. So Native Americans are still being left out of these reference databases or large genome-wide association study projects or just genomic projects in general. So this lack of equity and inclusion leaves Indigenous peoples without an option to improve their community's health or engage in precision medicine. So more factors that we can attribute to lack of inclusion is that tribes just for the have lack of access to quality healthcare. So they have high rates of cardiovascular disease and diabetes and things like that. So they're dealing with everyday health issues. And so if the healthcare system is not adequate for the communities, then it's really difficult to want to engage in genetic studies. There's also a factor of geographic isolation. At least for the Navajo Nation, like I said, it's the size of West Virginia, but we only have 13 grocery stores. So it's pretty difficult to get around. You need proper transportation to get anywhere. So engaging in things like clinical trials or just research projects in general will be pretty difficult. And then time constraints, right? We have federal grants and just grants in general that say, hey, you need to do a research project within 2 years, within 5 years. And doing community-based participatory research is going to take time. And then financial constraints. It's going to take a lot of money to engage communities to do it properly. And then, of course, you already have these established large cohorts of data, mostly of European ancestry. So why should I go out into the community and engage with them when I already have a large database that I can do my research on? And so natives are pretty much being left out. But then also we have, as natives, fear of outcomes from the research. So have misuse or having researchers studying migration and ancestry. One of the more sensitive topics is ancestry and migration, because a lot of tribal nations have histories and stories and languages that are centered around where they live, where they currently live, and where they have come from. And so telling tribal nations that you've come from Africa or you came from a different part of the world is not going to sit well, because it doesn't align with our, oral storytellings and our way of life. So that is a pretty sensitive subject to be studying. But also the misuse, and I'll be talking about 2 examples coming up of misuse of data. So there's this historical distrust and misuse of collected biospecimens from academic and clinical researchers. So this first example, and many of you may or may not have heard of this, but this tribe called the Havasupai tribe, which is located in Arizona, engaged with the Arizona State University researcher in 1989 to study diabetes, because there were high rates of diabetes in the community. The community gave written and oral consent to study the causes of behavioral and medical disorders. In the end, the researcher actually used the DNA to study schizophrenia, inbreeding, and population migration, and did not study diabetes. Or if that individual did not provide the results back to the tribe to say, well, I didn't find anything from your samples. And the researcher actually continued to share the DNA with others, with colleagues. And eventually the tribe sued the university and they settled out of court. So this led to huge mistrust in the research community. The samples were returned, but it took a lot of years and a lot of time, and the tribe had to really advocate for themselves to get those samples back. And in the end, they did not benefit from it as far as the research goes, but they were given compensation. However, I mean, we could kind of discuss the ethical issues around that too, and whether they really did benefit from this whole ordeal. Another example is of the Nutala tribe from the western part of Vancouver Island. They have a population of 4,000, and they provided 800 samples to an individual who was studying at University of British Columbia, and they wanted him to study rheumatoid arthritis because they had high rates of that in their community. So they wanted to see if there was a genetic component. However, the researcher again took the studies with them and studied HIV/AIDS, drug abuse, ancestry, also traveled the world pretty much and took the samples with him and loaned it out to colleagues. And there was no results returned to the people. And this was over a span of years. And this individual published over 200 papers from this DNA. And eventually, because the tribe spoke up, the samples were returned. So now I want to go into today. So because of these misuse and distrust of research community, we have a thriving native population of scientists and scholars that are wanting to learn more about genetics and wanting to empower their communities and be that bridge between Western science and their traditional knowledge and the science that they learned growing up from their communities and bridge that gap. And this is where they can do that, which is the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples and Genomics. And it's a week-long workshop, usually during the summers for the US. And it started in 2011 by a group of scientists. And the goal is to provide lab training, educate about ethical, legal, social implications of genetic research, and collaborate, learn from participants and experienced faculty members. And right now, the workshop actually moves around. So we had it at the University of Washington. It was in Texas one year. It was in Phoenix, Arizona another year. So we try to move the workshop in different locations in the US to learn more about the surrounding area, but to learn from the local individuals' expertise. So there have been over 200 students trained so far. And we have a website now. The website's listed there on the bottom of the screen. And there's a newsletter that we come up with every year as well. So now that Sing USA was kind of the starting point, we now have Sing Canada, there's Sing Australia, and then there's Sing Aotearoa in New Zealand. And this is, and then there's one more that's being developed in Mexico. So this has been a long process, but it's really great to see all these different Indigenous communities come together and say that they want to follow, this Sing curriculum and provide this to their community as well. And it's not just students that can attend, it's students, community members, faculty, just any profession can join the Sing workshop. And actually this year, we held the first International Sing Conference in January in New Zealand, and we discussed ethical concerns within the communities and present community-based genomic research integrated with Indigenous knowledge. And it was really a sight to see people from all over the world to come and speak or just be a part of the conversation, and I was really fortunate to attend. In Sing 2016, there was actually a reunion year, and this is where a group of individuals from different Sing cohorts came together and were selected, and we decided that we wanted to publish or put together a collective work. And these are the two papers that came out of that reunion session. And it's these two articles, A Framework for Ethical Genomic Research with Indigenous Communities, and then Advancing the Ethics of Paleogenomics. And the top photo is the one I'm going to be discussing next. So genetics research with Indigenous communities, the 6 guiding ethical principles. And so this is the real pivotal figure from the paper, and I'll be going through it a little bit more. So the reasons and goals. So it's to provide ethical guidelines for researchers who are conducting or plan to conduct genetics research with Indigenous communities. It would help to bridge the gap between Indigenous communities and genetic researchers. Furthermore, it would help build trust between the community and research entities. Demands for ethical genetic research with Indigenous peoples, increase diversity within genetic research, and increase benefits for participating individuals and communities. So the first I would like to highlight is understanding tribal research rules and regulations. So a lot of Indigenous communities have tribal IRBs that can be regional, local, or even national. The Indian Health Service, which is the typical healthcare system for U.S. Native Americans, has their own institutional review board. There may be broad research review boards that are probably not well recognized, but they're there. And then there's also smaller ones, which are like elder or community councils, and it really depends on the tribal nation or the group that you're trying to work with. A lot of groups are really small, and then some of them are really large. And then another principle is collaboration with the community as partners, not as subjects. So from the beginning to the end of the research process, you are engaging with the community, asking them what kind of questions they want to answer, whether they want to study certain topics, and they're a part of the proposal process, all the way to the publication, whether they're a co-author or they should be acknowledged. And you should also be mentioning that this was approved by tribal IRB and so forth, and also the community was involved. And then another third principle is the build cultural competency. So listen and learn from the community and try to understand the culture, language, their current history, their governance system, and traditional ways of knowing, as well as they're willing to provide. Just because you go and talk with the community doesn't mean that you have access to everything that they know. A lot of times, Indigenous people want to keep a lot of their traditional ways within their own communities and within their own groups. And if and when you are allowed into that information is up to them. And another way to build cultural competency is to integrate the science with community values. Another principle is transparency. So make goals known, work with community to develop the goals and hypotheses, and do not overpromise outcomes of the research. So I think this is one of the key principles, is to make sure that you are communicating effectively with the community and not saying that, okay, well, once we study this one project that's over the course of 5 years, we're definitely going to figure out the cure for diabetes. Overpromising is definitely something that you should not do. Build tribal capacity. So involve community members, involve Indigenous students from that community to train and work with you as researchers, and bring in those people to help with the research and guide the research study, and also listen to them. I think I've been a part of research studies where they want to bring in, the token native student and don't even listen to that student or don't value their perspective. These students come from the community. These scholars come from the community and learned about their ways of knowing from their family, from their elders. And so they have a lot of value to give to any research study. And then, of course, dissemination. So returning results, returning biospecimens, returning files, documents, and then providing the results and conclusions and including them in conference presentations, or if you're going to publish, making sure that the community gets the final version of the publication, also that approves the draft version of the publication. So work with communities on how to present research results and create an advisory council to provide feedback on how to disseminate those findings. And of course, if you look at the figure, we also have respect, equity, beneficence, and reciprocity intertwined with all those different factors of dissemination, capacity building, transparency, and cultural competency. And at the center of that is sovereignty and research regulation. So you should really be looking into how you should go about engaging with the community and knowing their rules and laws and regulations around research. So the principles promote stronger engagement. So it's a platform to provide an ethical way to engage with the Indigenous communities in regards to genomics research. It will take time and deliberate efforts to follow from both the community partners and research side. So it's really important to note that, especially in genetics research, it will take time. It will take time to continually have the conversations of, okay, why this particular project needs to be done, why you as researchers would be the most beneficial individuals to help this community, and what are the benefits in the end, because in the end, communities don't really care about publications. They care about outcomes. They care about whether their community is being helped, whether their healthcare is increased, whether they can alleviate certain diseases within their community. Provides a pathway to including underrepresented communities, and scientific advancements are distributed more equitably across communities, including Indigenous peoples, and prevents further mistrust in the scientific community. So if you follow these 6 principles and really include all of them, not just 1 or 2 or 3, I think that you can have a really robust research study and really engage in genetics research with Indigenous communities. So this is near my presentation, and I would just like to mention that we have this Native Voices in Computational Biology webinar series, which you're attending right now. The next one will be November 12th, and Dr. Keolu Fox is actually going to be talking about the All of Us research program that's here in the US, and it's the Illusion of Inclusion, which she also published on. And so that's going to be a really great presentation. In December, Crystal Sosi will be talking about the Native Biodata Consortium, and that's another neat thing that came out of seeing is that Crystal Sosi is a past participant and has been able to create her own biospecimen data bank in the in the Plains area of the U.S. and has been able to create it like for natives, by natives, and it's really a great consortium. And then in January, we have Matt Anderson, who studies the microbiome at Ohio State University. And in February, we have Stephanie Carroll, who's a part of the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona, and she'll be talking about data sovereignty. These are just the lineups that we have currently, but we're thinking it's going to be a year-long webinar series. So hopefully you can join all those presentations as well. So I'd like to open up for questions.
Thanks, Renee. That was really interesting, and I think a really great way to introduce this series. We have a schedule, I think, all the way through next August at least. So we have the 4 speakers she laid out of the next 4, and then there's more coming. I think it'll be really interesting, exciting to hear all of these talks. Maybe the easiest thing to do if people have questions would be to type them into the question area. And while people are thinking about that, Renee, maybe I can ask you if you can tell me a little bit about the plans for SING 2021.
Yeah, so unfortunately, SING wasn't able to be held this year because of COVID-19, and that remains to be seen for 2021. But we're thinking of University of Connecticut for next year, and it would be centered around technologies and genetic technologies. But we are uncertain because of COVID-19.
Sure. All right, I don't see any other questions in the chat. You can also just speak up, I think, if you unmute yourselves. All right. Oh.
If you can't unmute yourselves, but you can raise your hand and then I can unmute them for you. So
okay.
That will work as well.
All right. Anybody want to raise their hands or type questions into the question chat? Going once. Going twice. Oh, there's one. All right. This is a question from Sadias Yazdani, who's a master's student in structural genomics, and says, Renee, thanks for your talk. I'm a student at U of T. How can we as students help with raising awareness of this topic?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think the raising awareness is to bring it up in your classrooms. Like I mentioned, we have 2 publications that came out of the SING consortium and individuals from our group. So as I mentioned, Crystal Sosi, Keolu Fox, all these individuals have been publishing a lot recently and have been putting out papers about how to ethically engage with Indigenous communities. I think so researching those papers, finding out our names and finding those publications, or you can email me at rene.begay@cuanschutz.edu and I can send you a stack of papers, and then bringing them up in conversation in your classrooms and really advocating for Indigenous people, because I think we get kind of left out of the statistics, right? They're kind of just lumped into other when you're looking at health statistics, or we're just like, oh, Native Americans, it's like so small, we just don't even want to put it on the graph. So, but we're here, we're around, we're definitely not like the movies in general. So I really think that if we can get more allies to talk about who we are and just our general things that we're trying to get out there into the world and trying to advocate for our people, I think it would be really important if you just start there with the papers. And then also you can probably apply to SING for next year. We have a website, like I mentioned, the SING consortium.org, and you can apply to be a part of the SING workshop, and hopefully we'll have it in 2021 and you'll learn more there as well. And I also mentioned that we have you sequence your mitochondrial DNA. So we actually do some of that work and talk about the ethical issues around that and social implications of that as well.
Awesome. There's another question from Rachel Melamed, who is an assistant professor at UMass Lowell. And she says, I do secondary uses of data only. For secondary uses of data, what do you think are best practices?
Assuming it's indigenous data, I would say that it's important to ask whether it was ethically obtained. A lot of these reference databases have taken native DNA without consent for the most part. A lot of times they probably are ethical, but it doesn't hurt to ask. I would say that it's important to understand the rules and regulations for indigenous peoples and what they have around data sharing, their data sovereignty, and whether they consented to providing their genetic information to these databases. So I would definitely do your homework and do your research and find out if it was ethically obtained, so that you can do ethical research with that secondary data, because a lot of times that secondary data can have huge implications for those indigenous people. For example, when I mentioned the migration, that narrative is not consistent with who we are as individuals. And I would say it's even more important that you probably engage with local individuals from where that sample came from, because we have stories, we have our own ways of thinking about where we came from and how we should treat ancient DNA, for example, or we call them our ancestors, right? So there's just that tweak in that term means something completely different. So it's not just a bunch of letters on a computer, it's more than that for us.
Awesome. There's another question in the chat from Talon Arbuckle, who identifies as a student. This is, hi, Rene. I was wondering how you think we can address the issue of pan-indigenous rhetoric and the issues with tokenism within genetics and genomics. I struggle to correct the idea an indigenous person can speak on behalf of other indigenous groups.
Yeah, I even struggle with that. An individual will, first of all, they mistake me as being Mexican or Hispanic. And I'm like, no, I'm indigenous, I'm Native American. But then they'll want me to be a part of any study that involves indigenous people, right? And I think it's important to know the history. And I think that's where it probably will stem from, is to understand the history of different local native groups. And I think that's where you can really decipher, like, okay, this, for example, the Navajo Nation has within it the Hopi tribe, the Hopi Nation, but we don't speak for the Hopi, and the Hopi do not speak for us. So you have to, look at the geography, look at the history, and I think that's where a lot of people don't do their homework. They just kind of assume, okay, you're all, the same. Why should I reach out to that individual? They look similar. So I think reaching out into the history books is where it's going to come from. At least that's my opinion.